There are cities that never truly sleep. Cities where the rain falls in sheets against cracked concrete and the streetlights flicker like dying stars. Cities where the honest people lock their doors by sundown and the dishonest ones begin their work. Budapest was one of those cities. And somewhere in its rain-soaked industrial sprawl, a man in a red helmet was watching. Jason Todd had been tracking the Morozov syndicate for 3 weeks. A weapons trafficking operation spanning 6 Eastern European countries, moving military-grade hardware through ports and abandoned rail lines with a precision that would impress most intelligence agencies. Jason had followed the money from Gotham to Vienna, from Vienna to Prague, and from Prague to the rotting edges of this Hungarian capital. Every lead had pointed here. Every thread of evidence had wound its way into this decaying industrial district, like veins leading to a diseased heart. But something about this operation was wrong. Not wrong in the way Jason was used to. He had dismantled criminal empires before. He understood the rhythms of illegal trade, the logic of violence for profit, the predictable cruelty of men who sold weapons to the highest bidder. This was different. The patterns did not follow any logic he recognized. Entire shipments of arms were vanishing between checkpoints. Not stolen, not redirected, simply gone as if the trucks had driven into the fog and dissolved. Security teams assigned to protect the cargo were disappearing overnight. At first, the syndicate blamed rival organizations, then internal betrayal, then sheer incompetence. But the disappearances continued, and then the bodies started appearing, drained of blood. Jason had seen violence in every form a human mind could conceive. He had died once and come back. He had walked through the worst corners of Gotham and stared into the faces of men who killed for pleasure. But drained of blood was a new entry in his catalog of horrors. He filed it away and kept watching. It was on the 4th night of surveillance that everything changed. Jason was positioned on a rusted fire escape overlooking a loading dock. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the air thick and damp. Below him, a group of armed men were unloading crates from a freight truck. Standard operation, standard weapons, standard criminals doing standard criminal things. And then the darkness moved. It happened so fast that an ordinary observer would have missed it entirely. One moment there were 8 men standing under the pale dock lights. The next moment there were 4. The other 4 had been pulled into the shadows with a speed that defied physics. Jason heard the sounds before he understood them. Wet tearing, bone snapping, a scream that lasted less than a second before it was choked into silence. The remaining men opened fire into the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit the loading dock in strobing bursts of white. And then the creatures came into view. They were tall and pale, moving with an elegance that seemed obscene against the backdrop of slaughter. Their eyes reflected the light like polished glass. Their mouths opened to reveal teeth that did not belong in any human jaw. The word surfaced in Jason's mind with clinical detachment. He did not waste time questioning it. He simply observed. But the vampires were not alone. From the opposite end of the loading dock, something else emerged. Covered in dark fur that glistened with rainwater. Wolves that walked like men. They crashed into the vampires with a ferocity that shook the ground, and suddenly Jason was watching a war. Claws met flesh, fangs met bone. The two species tore into each other with a hatred so ancient it radiated from their movements like heat from a furnace. The human criminals were forgotten. Their bodies lay scattered across the concrete, irrelevant casualties in a conflict that clearly predated them by centuries. Jason watched the carnage unfold with the same steady gaze he used to study crime scenes. His breathing remained even. His heartbeat remained controlled. Most men would have run. Most men would have questioned their sanity, called for help, begged for an explanation. Jason Todd was not most men. He reached into his jacket and pulled out both pistols. He checked the magazines. He chambered around in each weapon with a smooth mechanical click that was swallowed by the sounds of war below. Monsters or not, they were still targets. And Jason Todd had never missed. Most people, upon discovering that vampires and werewolves exist, would retreat into denial. They would convince themselves they had hallucinated, suffered a psychotic break, or simply misunderstood what they had seen. They would run home, lock every door, and spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Jason Todd spent the next 72 hours building a tactical profile on both species. That was the difference between an ordinary person and a man who had been trained by the greatest detective on earth, killed by a madman, resurrected in a mystical pit, and forged into something that existed in the narrow space between hero and executioner. Jason did not fear the unknown. He cataloged it, he dissected it, and then he found a way to destroy it. The first thing he noticed was the hierarchy. The vampires operated with a rigid military structure. Death dealers served as enforcers. Elders controlled territory. Coven houses functioned as command centers disguised as old-world architecture. The Lycans were more decentralized, operating in packs with shifting allegiance, but their strength was raw and physical in ways the vampires could not match. Two armies, two ideologies, one underground war raging beneath the surface of a city that had no idea it was a battlefield. Jason began with reconnaissance. He tracked vampire patrols through the old quarter, mapping their routes and schedules with the same discipline he had used against Gotham's criminal families. He observed Lycan movements through the sewer systems and subway tunnels, noting how they communicated through sound and scent rather than technology. He studied their combat behavior during skirmishes, watching how the vampires relied on speed and precision while the Lycans used overwhelming force and pack coordination. Then he began experimenting. Silver was the first breakthrough. Jason sourced raw silver from a black market supplier and modified his ammunition. The first Lycan he shot with a silver round dropped like a marionette with its strings cut. That confirmed the folklore. Next came ultraviolet technology. Jason rigged portable UV emitters from modified industrial lamps and tested them against a lone vampire he had isolated in an alley. The creature burned from the inside out, its skin cracking like dried clay in a furnace. The legends were true. Every monster had a weakness, and weaknesses could be weaponized. Within 2 weeks, Jason had assembled an arsenal specifically designed for supernatural warfare. Silver-jacketed hollow points for the Lycans, UV grenades and modified incendiary rounds for the vampires, tripwire traps using silver wire. Ambush positions and locations where neither faction expected a threat because no human had ever been foolish enough to challenge them. Then he started hunting. The first kills were surgical. A vampire enforcer taken out from a rooftop with a single silver tipped round through the skull. 2 Lycans eliminated in a sewer junction using a combination of flashbang grenades and close-quarters gunfire. A vampire safe house destroyed with thermite charges placed during daylight hours when the occupants were dormant. Each attack was precise. Each retreat was flawless. Jason left no evidence. He left no witnesses. He left only bodies. And the Underworld began to notice. Rumors spread through both factions like poison through a bloodstream. Someone was hunting them. Not a vampire. Not a Lycan. Something else. A human, some whispered, though the idea was so absurd that most dismissed it immediately. How could a human kill a death dealer? How could a mortal destroy a Lycan pack leader? The vampire covens called him a ghost. The Lycan packs called him a death sentence. The elders dismissed him as an inconvenience that would resolve itself, because humans had always been inconveniences that resolved themselves. Jason did not care what they called him. Names were irrelevant. Fear was the only currency that mattered in a war, and he was becoming the wealthiest man in the Underworld. He reloaded his weapons and studied the next target on his list. There was always a next target. There was always another monster wearing civilization like a costume, pretending that centuries of murder made them something more than criminals. Jason. Todd had a very simple philosophy about criminals. They all fall eventually. Selene had lived for over 600 years. In that time, she had watched empires crumble, religions rise and fall, technologies reshape the surface world beyond recognition. She had killed more Lycans than she could count and survived betrayals that would have destroyed lesser vampires. Very little surprised her anymore. Surprise was a luxury reserved for the young and the mortal. But the reports crossing her desk were beginning to bother her. 3 vampire safe houses destroyed in a single month. A Lycan den wiped out in the factory district. 2 death dealers, veteran warriors with centuries of combat experience, found dead in a drainage canal with bullet wounds that had cauterized their flesh from the inside. The ammunition recovered from one of the scenes contained trace elements of ultraviolet compounds bonded to the metal at a molecular level. Whoever had designed those rounds understood vampire physiology with uncomfortable precision. Celine requested permission to investigate. The Coven elders dismissed her concerns. Humans posed no threat to their kind. They never had. The idea that a single mortal could be responsible for this level of destruction was not merely unlikely. It was laughable. Celine did not find it laughable. She found it interesting. She tracked the pattern of attacks across the city, mapping locations and timestamps until a rhythm emerged. The hunter was methodical, disciplined. Every strike targeted infrastructure rather than random patrols. This was not someone killing out of fear or self-defense. This was someone dismantling an organization with the patience of a surgeon and the aggression of a soldier. On the 17th night of her investigation, Celine found him. He was standing in a warehouse near the river district, surrounded by the remnants of a Lycan ambush he had apparently turned inside out. 4 Lycan bodies lay on the concrete floor, each killed with clinical efficiency. The masked figure was reloading his weapons as casually as a man refilling a coffee cup. Celine descended from the rafters without a sound. She had killed humans before. Quick. Fragile creatures that broke so easily under vampire strength. She expected this to be no different. She was wrong. The moment her boots touched the floor, he moved. Not with the clumsy panic of a frightened human, with the fluid economy of someone who had been expecting her. 2 shots rang out before Celine could close the distance. She dodged one. The second grazed her shoulder, and the pain was unlike anything a normal bullet should have caused. UV rounds. He had come prepared for her kind. The fight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, but it was 90 seconds of absolute violence. Celine attacked with the speed and precision that 6 centuries of warfare had refined into instinct. The masked hunter countered with a fighting style that blended martial arts, military close-quarters combat, and a viciousness that suggested intimate familiarity with pain. He did not fight like a human trying to survive. He fought like a human who had decided that survival was someone else's problem. Celine knocked him through a support pillar. He rolled, came up firing. She disarmed him. He detonated a UV flash device that forced her backward. Neither could finish the other. The fight ended when both realized that pressing further would cost more than either was willing to spend in that moment. They stood across from each other in the ruined warehouse, breathing hard. Celine's wound was already healing. The hunter's helmet was cracked, but his posture showed no pain. He spoke first. "You were fast, but you telegraph your left side when you transition from offense to defense." Celine stared at him. No human had ever analyzed her fighting technique during a battle. No human had ever survived long enough to try. "What are you?" she asked. The answer came without hesitation, without fear. "The same thing I have always been. A man who does not believe monsters get to operate without consequences." Celine watched him disappear into the shadows of the warehouse, and for the first time in decades, she felt something she thought she had outgrown. Curiosity. This human was not prey. He was something else entirely. Jason had always understood that the world operated on layers. The surface was what ordinary people saw. The clean streets, the functioning governments, the polite illusion of civilization. Beneath that surface was the criminal underworld he had spent years navigating. Drug cartels, arms dealers, human traffickers, all operating in the shadows of the same cities where children went to school and families ate dinner together. But beneath even that layer, he now realized, was something older. Something that had been running its own empire since before the concept of empires existed. The underworld was not a metaphor. It was a literal kingdom built beneath the foundations of the modern world. Jason discovered the first entrance through a Lycan he had captured and interrogated in the basement of an abandoned textile factory. The creature had been reluctant to talk at first. Lycans, Jason had learned, were fiercely loyal to their packs and considered death preferable to betrayal. But Jason was patient in the way that only someone trained by Batman could be patient. He did not use cruelty. He used precision. He applied pressure to the exact points where loyalty fractured under the weight of self-preservation, and eventually the Lycan talked. What it described was staggering. Beneath Budapest, a network of tunnels stretched for hundreds of miles. Some dated back to the Roman occupation. Others had been carved during the Ottoman Wars. The vampires and Lycans had claimed these spaces centuries ago, expanding them into underground fortresses connected by passageways that no human map had ever recorded. Down there, entire armies moved in darkness. Armories stockpiled weapons both ancient and modern. Laboratories conducted experiments that blurred the line between biology and horror. Council chambers held meetings that decided the fate of thousands. Jason descended into the tunnels on a Tuesday night carrying enough ammunition for a small war. The scale of what he found exceeded even his expectations. The vampire strongholds were architectural marvels. Gothic chambers carved from bedrock, lit by chandeliers that burned with cold blue flame. Armored death dealers patrolled corridors lined with portraits of elders who had ruled for millennia. The atmosphere was one of aristocratic permanence, as if the vampires had built their civilization to outlast the sun itself. The Lycan territories were different, more industrial. Jason moved through sections that resembled underground military installations, with reinforced concrete walls and heavy steel doors designed to contain transformations. Training grounds echoed with the sounds of combat drills. Medical bays housed Lycans in various stages of experimentation, their bodies modified and enhanced by science that no surface institution could have sanctioned. Two empires, two armies, locked in a war so old that neither side could remember what started it, only that it must continue. Jason recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen this before, not with vampires and werewolves, but with crime families in Gotham, with cartels in South America, with warlords in the Middle East. The specifics changed, but the structure never did. Two powerful organizations fighting over territory and ideology, using soldiers who believed in the cause while the leaders at the top lived in luxury and counted their centuries like other men counted their money. This was not a supernatural conflict. This was organized crime wearing mythology as a disguise. And organized crime had a vulnerability that supernatural power could not protect against. Leadership. Every empire, no matter how ancient, depended on the people at the top. Remove the generals and the army fragments. Destroy the council and the coven collapses into infighting. Kill the alpha and the pack tears itself apart trying to fill the vacuum. Jason began compiling a target list. He identified 3 vampire elders who controlled the largest covens in Eastern Europe. He mapped the hierarchy of the Lycan packs, tracing the chain of command from foot soldiers to pack leaders to the shadowy figures who coordinated strategy across regions. He cross-referenced locations, schedules, and security protocols until each target had a file as detailed as anything the CIA could produce. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would not try to win the war. He would not pick a side. He would not play the game by the rules that vampires and Lycans had established over centuries of bloodshed. He would burn the game board. Both factions believed they were fighting each other. They had spent so long focused on their ancient enemy that neither had considered the possibility of a third force entering the equation. A force with no allegiance, no supernatural power, and absolutely no interest in negotiation. Jason loaded his weapons, memorized the tunnel maps, and checked his explosive charges one final time. The war beneath the city was about to meet the only thing more dangerous than a monster. A man with a plan. The first strike came at 3 in the morning on a night when the rain had returned to Budapest, with the kind of relentless intensity that made the city feel like it was being slowly erased. Jason chose the Vampire Coven House on Andrassy Avenue as his opening target. Intelligence had confirmed that a senior elder named Victor Draven was holding a council session in the underground chambers beneath the building. 14 death dealers guarded the perimeter. Security systems monitored every entrance, every corridor, every shadow. Jason entered through the sewage system. He had spent 2 days mapping the drainage network that connected to the coven's lower levels. The vampires had sealed the obvious access points, but they had overlooked a narrow maintenance conduit that predated the building by 200 years. Jason crawled through 400 meters of darkness, placed shaped charges at 3 structural points along the foundation, and set the timers for simultaneous detonation. The explosion collapsed the eastern wing of the underground complex. Stone and steel folded inward like a crushed aluminum can. The blast killed 4 death dealers instantly and trapped another 6 in the rubble. In the chaos that followed, Jason moved through the smoke and dust with the calm efficiency of a surgeon operating on a patient who happened to be an ancient vampire stronghold. Victor Draven died in his council chamber. 2 UV rounds through the chest. The elder had time to register shock on his ancient face before the ultraviolet compound ignited his blood from within. He crumbled to ash in his ornate chair, still wearing the expression of a creature that could not comprehend how a human had reached him. Jason was gone before the surviving death dealers could organize a response. The second strike came 48 hours later. A Lycan command post operating beneath an abandoned metro station in the 8th District. The pack leader, a massive creature named Gregor who had survived 3 centuries of warfare, was coordinating a counteroffensive against a rival Lycan faction. His lieutenants surrounded him. His soldiers filled the tunnels. Jason did not bother with subtlety this time. He rigged the ventilation system with silver nitrate gas canisters and detonated them remotely. The gas flooded the tunnels in seconds. For Lycan, silver nitrate in aerosol form was the equivalent of nerve gas. Gregor and his entire command staff were incapacitated within minutes. Jason entered the tunnels wearing a gas mask and executed the leadership with silver rounds. Precise. 1 shot per target. The third strike targeted a vampire weapons depot hidden in a wine cellar beneath a luxury hotel in the Castle District. Jason destroyed it with thermite charges during the day when the vampire guards were at their weakest. The explosion was so powerful that the hotel above suffered structural damage. The surface world blamed a gas leak. The Underworld knew better. The fourth strike. Each attack was different in execution but identical in philosophy. Target the leadership. Destroy the infrastructure. Vanish before the enemy can respond. Jason was not fighting a war of attrition. He was conducting a decapitation campaign against 2 empires simultaneously, and the results were devastating. Within 3 weeks, the vampire covens had lost 2 elders, 11 senior death dealers, and 4 major strongholds. The Lycan packs had lost 3 pack leaders, 2 weapons caches, and their primary communication network. Both factions were reeling. Command structures that had functioned for centuries were suddenly fragmented. Orders contradicted each other. Reinforcements arrived at locations that had already been destroyed. Paranoia spread through both organizations like infection through an open wound. And then something unprecedented happened. The vampires and Lycans stopped fighting each other. Not because they had achieved peace. Not because some diplomatic breakthrough had bridged centuries of hatred. They stopped fighting each other because they were both too busy trying to survive the same enemy. The word carried a weight it had never held before in the Underworld. Humans were cattle. Humans were background noise. Humans were the ignorant masses who lived on the surface and never looked down. But this human had killed elders. This human had destroyed fortresses. This human had walked into the most heavily guarded places in the supernatural world and walked out again, leaving nothing but fire and bodies behind him. For the first time in recorded Underworld history, vampires and Lycans began fearing the same name. They did not know his real name, of course. They knew only the red helmet, the twin pistols, the absolute refusal to stop. In the vampire covens, they called him the Red Wraith. In the Lycan dens, they called him the Silver Ghost. Jason would have found both names amusing if he had cared about names at all. But he did not. He cared about results, and the results spoke for themselves. The alliance was announced in a chamber so deep beneath Budapest that the stone walls wept with moisture from underground rivers that had been flowing since before the last ice age. Vampire elders sat across from Lycan alphas at a table carved from a single block of black granite. Neither side looked at the other with anything resembling trust. 6 centuries of war do not dissolve because of a shared inconvenience. But 6 centuries of war can pause when the alternative is extinction. The terms were simple: a temporary cessation of hostilities, combined intelligence resources, a coordinated operation to locate and eliminate the masked human who had done what neither faction had managed to do to the other in 600 years of trying: bring them to their knees. The trap was designed by the oldest tactical minds in the Underworld. Vampire strategists who had orchestrated campaigns during the Crusades worked alongside Lycan war leaders who had survived both world wars. They studied the hunter's patterns, his preference for underground engagements, his reliance on choke points and environmental advantages, his tendency to target leadership in isolated strikes. They would give him exactly what he wanted. A false intelligence leak suggested that both factions were holding a joint leadership summit in the catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Basilica. The information was planted through channels that the hunter had been monitoring for weeks. Every detail was crafted to be irresistible. Every element was designed to draw him into a killing ground where 300 of the Underworld's deadliest warriors would be waiting. Jason took the bait. He knew it was a trap before he entered the first tunnel. The intelligence was too clean, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with his operational patterns. A lesser operative would have stayed away. Jason walked in anyway, because traps only work when the prey behaves like prey. Jason had spent 2 days preparing the catacombs before the supposed summit. He had entered through routes that neither faction knew existed, passages he had discovered during his weeks of subterranean reconnaissance. He placed explosive charges at 12 structural points. He rigged silver wire across corridors at neck height. He positioned UV emitters behind false walls with remote triggers. He turned the killing ground into his killing ground. When the 300 warriors closed in, Jason detonated the first ring of charges. The explosions sealed the primary exits and collapsed 2 of the main corridors. Panic erupted instantly. Vampires and Lycans who had never fought together found themselves stumbling over each other in confined spaces filled with dust and debris. Jason activated the UV emitters. Blinding ultraviolet light flooded 3 of the remaining corridors. Vampires screamed and retreated directly into sections where silver wire had been strung at precise intervals. The Lycans charged toward the source of the explosions and ran into a corridor seeded with silver nitrate mines. The detonation scattered silver fragments through the air like shrapnel designed by the devil himself. In the chaos, the ancient hatred resurfaced. A Lycan, blinded by pain and rage, attacked the nearest vampire. The vampire retaliated. Within minutes, the carefully constructed alliance was disintegrating into exactly what it had always been. 2 factions that despised each other, now trapped in a confined space with every reason to resume killing. Jason moved through the pandemonium like a ghost through fog. He fired when he had clear shots. He detonated charges when clusters of enemies gathered. He used the confusion as a weapon more lethal than any bullet in his arsenal. By the time the survivors clawed their way to the surface through secondary exits, the catacombs were a graveyard. Dozens of the Underworld's finest warriors lay dead in the rubble. The alliance had lasted less than 4 hours before collapsing into mutual recrimination and blame. Jason emerged from an access tunnel 6 blocks away. His armor was torn. His ammunition was nearly depleted. 3 of his ribs were cracked, and his left arm had a gash deep enough to need stitches. He walked to a safe house, treated his wounds, and began planning his next operation, because the war was not over. But the monsters now knew something they had never known before. They were not the most dangerous things in the dark. The rain returned to Budapest as it always did, steady and indifferent, washing the streets clean of whatever sins the night had produced. From a rooftop 17 stories above the old quarter, Todd stood motionless against the sky and watched the city breathe. Below him, the world carried on as it always had. Taxicabs traced yellow lines through wet streets. Couples walked beneath shared umbrellas. Restaurant windows glowed with warm light and the comfortable laughter of people who had no idea what lived beneath their feet. The war had not ended. Jason had never expected it to. A conflict that had burned for 6 centuries would not be extinguished by one man in a single campaign, no matter how devastating that campaign had been. The vampires still haunted the old quarter. The Lycans still prowled the tunnels. Blood was still spilled in the spaces between the world that humans knew and the world that humans were never meant to see. But something had changed. The vampire covens no longer operated with the arrogance of apex predators. Patrols moved in larger groups now. Safe houses relocated more frequently. Elders who had once considered themselves untouchable began traveling with doubled security details and sleeping in chambers with reinforced doors. Fear had entered their ancient bones and settled there like a winter that refused to end. The Lycans were no different. Pack leaders who had once roamed freely through their underground territories now posted sentries at every junction. Communication protocols changed weekly. Trust, already fragile within the packs, had fractured further as every unexplained sound in the tunnels raised the same terrifying question. Is it him? 3 words that had become the most powerful force in the underworld. More powerful than vampire speed. More powerful than Lycan strength. more powerful than the centuries of tradition and hatred that had defined both species since their creation. Is it him? Jason holstered his pistols and pulled his hood against the rain. He had intercepted communications suggesting that a new Lycan faction was attempting to expand into Western Europe using human trafficking networks as cover. The details were still incomplete, but the pattern was familiar. Monsters wearing the skin of civilization, preying on the vulnerable, believing themselves beyond consequence. They would learn otherwise. Somewhere in the underworld, in the candlelit chambers of vampire councils and the torch-lit dens of Lycan packs, a new legend had taken root. Not a legend of a god or a prophecy or a supernatural being of immense power. Something far more unsettling. The legend of an ordinary man who had walked into their world uninvited, studied their weaknesses with the patience of a scholar, and dismantled their empires with the precision of an executioner. A man who could not be bought, could not be turned, could not be frightened. The vampires and Lycans had spent 6 centuries believing that the darkness belonged to them. Jason Todd had proven them wrong. The darkness had a new owner now, and he wore a red hood.